The recorded music industry has a long and troubling history of grimy, greasy, backstabbing, underhanded, trifling, unethical practices dating back to its inception in the early 20th century. These practices have evolved over time, but many of the underlying issues, such as exploitation, manipulation, oppression, suppression, repression, persecution, lack of transparency, and inequitable distribution of profits, remain pervasive, straight up and down. This is a brief account of a few of these practices, including key dates, notable cases, and the individuals and companies involved. Bessie Smith. Known as the Empress of the Blues, Smith was one of Columbia Records' biggest stars in the 1920s. Despite her immense popularity, she earned only an extremely minuscule fraction of what her recordings generated for the label. Louis Armstrong's early contracts with OK Records and later Columbia Records in the 1920s, 1940s granted him little control over his music. His manager, Greasy Joe Glazer, pillaged and plundered ownership of his publishing rights, leaving Armstrong financially vulnerable despite his global notoriety. Ma Rainey, one of the first professional blues singers, Ma Rainey recorded for Paramount Records in the 1920s. Despite her influence, she was paid a flat fee per session and received no royalties, a common injustice for black artists at the time. Blind Lemon Jefferson, a pioneer of Texas blues, Jefferson recorded for Paramount Records in the 1920s. Despite selling millions of records, he died penniless in 1929 due to exploitative contracts that paid him per session, not royalties. Jimmie Rodgers, known as the father of country music, Rodgers signed with Victor Records in 1927. Despite his pioneering influence, he earned only a flat fee per recording session, leaving his estate impoverished after his death in 1933. Leadbelly, Huddie Ledbetter, the folk blues icon, was discovered in prison in 1933 by folklorists John Lomax and Alan Lomax, who recorded his songs for the Library of Congress. Despite his later commercial success, Leadbelly received minimal compensation and died in poverty in 1949. Dinah Washington signed to Mercury Records in the 1940s. The Queen of the Blues received only modest royalties despite her crossover success. Her masters were later sold to conglomerates without her estate's consent. Sister Rosetta Tharpe. A gospel and early rock pioneer, Tharpe's work was straight-up ganked by white artists who received more credit and financial reward. Her 1944 hit Strange Things Happening Every Day was a precursor to rock and roll, but she was rarely acknowledged in the mainstream until decades later. In 1955, Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti, which became a massive hit. However, Specialty Records founder Art Rupert kept all the chalupa and paid him only $50 for the publishing rights, leaving Richard with just half a cent per record sold. Straight like that. Chuck Berry faced similar exploitation by Chess Records. Despite his groundbreaking contributions to rock and roll, his royalties were breadcrumbs compared to the profits generated by his music. Many black artists in the early 20th century were systematically played, underpaid, and denied ownership of their music on mummers. Labels like RCA Victor and Paramount Records marketed black artists' work to segregated audiences while withholding equitable pay. For example, in 1920, Mamie Smith recorded Crazy Blues for OK Records, launching the Race Records era. Despite being one of the first artists in the music industry to go platinum, selling over 1 million copies, she received only a flat fee and no royalties, a common fate for black artists of the time. Arthur Big Boy Crudup. Crudup wrote and recorded That's All Right in 1946 for RCA Victor. Elvis Presley's 1954 cover became a rock and roll milestone, but Crudup was never paid royalties and died in poverty in 1974. Big Mama Thornton recorded Hound Dog in 1952 for Peacock Records. The song was smooth-jacked by Elvis Presley, who received far more residuals and credit, while Thornton was paid a one-time fee and no royalties. Sam Cooke. Cooke's groundbreaking soul hits for RCA Victor in the 1950s earned him just a measly 2.5% royalties. His estate later fought legal battles to reclaim rights to his catalogue. James Brown, the godfather of soul, signed with King Records in 1956. His greasy contract granted him only 1 to 2% royalties, and he later bossed up and sued the label in the 1960s to reclaim ownership of his master recordings, ultimately succeeding in 1971. Elvis Presley, managed by Colonel Tom Parker, Presley was subjected to highly restrictive agreements that siphoned off much of his earnings. Parker took an estimated 50% of Presley's income, far above industry norms. The Monkees, created as a TV band. In 1966, the Monkees had little control over their music or image. Don Kirshner, head of Colgham's Records, selected their songs and session musicians, and the band had to fight for the right to play on their own records. The Crystals, under producer Phil Spector's Phillies Records. In the 1960s, the girl group was forced to record songs without receiving proper credit or royalties. Lead singer Lala Brooks later revealed they were paid $50 per session with no residuals. The Ronettes, the girl group, led by Ronnie Spector, signed with Phil Spector's Phillies Records in 1963. Their contract included a clause forfeiting all royalties to Sticky Finger Phil, leaving them unpaid despite hits like Be My Baby. The Beach Boys, Murray Wilson, the band's manager and father of 3 members, sold the rights to their entire song catalogue to Irving Almo Music in 1969 for $700,000 without the band's full consent. The catalogue would later be valued in the hundreds of millions. In 1971, Billy Joel signed a 10-album deal with Family Productions. Label head Artie Ripoff not only botched the production of Joel's debut album, but also retained control over his publishing rights. Joel escaped the contract only after Columbia Records bought it out in 1972. Badly managed by Stan Polly starting in 1970, Badfinger fell victim to one of the most egregious financial abuses in music history. Steele and Stan funneled all their earnings into his personal accounts, leaving members destitute. Frontman Pete Ham tragically mentioned Stan in his Soyside note in 1975. Otis Redding, Redding's Stax Records contract in the 1960s, granted him little creative control. His posthumous hit, Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, was altered without his input before release. Carole King. As a brill-building songwriter in the 1960s, King wrote dozens of hits for Olden Music, later acquired by Screen Gems Columbia Music. She and other songwriters were often pressured to churn out formulaic hits with little say in how their songs were used or credited. The Beatles lost control of their publishing rights when Northern Songs was sold to ATV in 1969. This led Paul McCartney to later buy back portions of the catalogue through MPL Communications. The Supremes. Under Berry Gordy's Motown Records, the group faced strict control over their image, music and public appearances. Florence Ballard, a founding member, was forced out of the group in 1967 and died in poverty in 1976. Bob Dylan versus Albert Grossman, Dylan's manager. Grossman negotiated despicable deals without Dylan's full knowledge, taking substantial commissions from his earnings. This led Dylan to eventually part ways with Grossman in the late 1960s. The Temptations. Motown's Berry Gordy dominated and dictated every aspect of the group's career, including their choreography and vocal arrangements. Members like David Ruffin were replaced without consultation when they challenged Gordy's imperial authority, straight like that. Janis Joplin. Under Columbia Records, Joplin faced pressure to conform to commercial expectations, with label executives, notably Clive Davis, often dictating song choices and production decisions, limiting her creative freedom. John Fogerty, Creedence Clearwater Revival. Fogerty signed away his publishing rights to Fantasy Records in the late 1960s. In the 1980s, label head Saul Zaentz sued Fogerty for allegedly plagiarizing his own work, and Fogerty spent years in court to regain some control over his catalogue. Patti LaBelle versus Philadelphia International Records. LaBelle's 1970s hits with the group LaBelle were controlled by the label, which refused to release her solo masters until muscled by a 1980 lawsuit. Tom Petty versus MCA Records. In 1981, Petty sued MCA to void his contract after the label attempted to sneak and sell his back catalogue without his consent. He later renegotiated a landmark deal that granted him ownership of his masters. In 1992, Prince signed a $100 million contract with Warner Brothers, but disputes over creative control and ownership of his masters led him to change his name to an unpronounceable symbol and write Slave on his face during performances. He left Warner Brothers in 1996, but re-signed briefly in 2014. George Michael versus Sony Music. In 1992, Michael sued Sony Music over what he described as professional slavery. He argued that his contract was unfairly restrictive and prevented him from releasing music on his own terms. The lawsuit ultimately failed, but it highlighted systemic issues in artist-label relationships. Billy Corgan, the Smashing Pumpkins. In the 1990s, Corgan publicly criticised Virgin Records for repackaging and re-releasing the band's music without their input, calling it exploitation of the artist's work for corporate gain. De La Soul versus Tommy Boy Records. The hip-hop group's 1989 debut, 3 Feet High and Rising, became a classic, but their greasy contract with Tommy Boy granted them only 10% royalties. In 2019, they crowdfunded to buy back their masters after Warner Music Group refused to release them. Marvin Gaye. The Motown legend struggled with financial disputes with Berry Gordy, who controlled his royalties. After Gaye's 1984 death, his family fought for decades to regain control of his estate. Billy Joel. In the late 1980s, Joel discovered that his manager and former brother-in-law, Frank Weber, had embezzled over $30 million. Joel sued Weber and spent years recovering his finances, highlighting the vulnerability of even successful artists to financial abuse. TLC versus LaFace Records. Despite selling 10 million copies of Crazy Sexy Cool, 1994, TLC filed for bankruptcy in 1995 due to a greasy contract with LaFace Records that paid them only 35 cents per album sold. Manager Pebbles Reed was accused of siphoning their earnings. Lou the Pearlman bamboozled both NSYNC and Backstreet Boys by taking an exorbitant share of their earnings while disguising himself as an additional member entitled to royalties. NSYNC sued the Pearlman and BMG for $150 million in 1999, eventually settling out of court. In 2005, Leonard Cohen discovered that his longtime manager, Kelly Lynch, had embezzled over $5 million from his retirement fund, leaving him nearly penniless. Cohen was forced to return to touring in his 70s to recover financially. The Pixies' 1988 debut album, Surfer Rosa, earned them just a measly $12,000 despite critical acclaim. Their label, 4AD, retained ownership of their masters until a 2014 reissue deal. In 2001, the Dixie Chicks accused sneaky Sony Music of playing and underpaying $4 million in royalties from their first 2 multi-platinum albums. The dispute ended with a renegotiated contract that included a $20 million bonus for the band. Pandora's low royalties. In 2013, singer-songwriter David Lowery, Camper Van Beethoven, sued Pandora for $17 million in unpaid royalties, exposing how streaming services often underreport plays to avoid payouts. You better ask somebody. In 2007, Radiohead released In Rainbows as a pay-what-you-want download to bypass traditional label structures, criticizing major labels for underpaying artists. Despite their success, most artists cannot replicate this model. Real spill. Rem versus Warner Brothers. In 1996, the band's contract renegotiation forced Warner to grant them ownership of pre-1996 masters, a rare victory against label control. Streaming platforms like Apple Music and Amazon Music have been criticized for paying artists even less than Spotify. Spotify pays artists between $0.003 and $0.005 per stream, with most revenue going to rights holders, typically record labels or publishers, rather than directly to artists. David Byrne of the Talking Heads has been a vocal critic of streaming platforms like Spotify and Apple Music, highlighting over a decade ago, in 2013, that artists often receive less than a penny per stream, while labels and platforms take the majority of revenue. Zoe Keating, the indie cellist, revealed in 2015 that she earned just $0.003 per Spotify stream, sparking debates about fair pay. Her advocacy led to congressional testimony on artist rights. In 2015, Taylor Swift wrote an open letter to Apple Music protesting the platform's penny-pinching policy of not paying artists during users' free trial periods. Apple reversed its policy within 24 hours, but the incident highlighted the power imbalance between tech companies and artists. Spotify's Secret Genius playlist. In 2017, Spotify sneakily replaced established artists with unsigned acts in curated playlists, reducing royalty payouts to major label artists. Fraudulent Frank Sinatra. Tracks. In 2023, AI-generated Sinatra covers flooded streaming platforms, with royalties funneled to tech companies rather than his estate. In 2023, AI-generated songs mimicking Eminem's voice appeared on YouTube and streaming platforms, raising concerns about copyright, royalties, and the potential for fraud. Britney Spears and others have highlighted how the current music streaming royalties system exacerbates financial inequities for artists under restrictive contracts. Artists such as Zoe Keating have publicly shared data showing how difficult it is to earn a living from streaming royalties. Numerous independent artists have reported that third parties fraudulently claim ownership of their music through YouTube's Content ID system, diverting ad revenue and royalties away from the rightful creators. In 2014, Kesha filed a lawsuit against producer Dr. Luke, alleging sexual assault and emotional abuse. Signed to Kemosabe Records, a Sony imprint under Dr. Luke, Kesha was contractually bound to work with her alleged abuser. She also accused him of forcing her into exploitative contracts that limited her creative freedom and financial independence. Her legal battle to break free from her greasy contract, 2014-2021, drew global attention to the lack of artist protections in this predatory industry and power imbalances between artists and producers. In 2019, Scooter Braun's Ithaca Holdings acquired Big Machine Records, including Taylor Swift's master recordings from her first 6 albums. Swift publicly condemned the sale and began re-recording her albums to regain ownership under new terms. Straight like that. In 2020, Sam Smith revealed they had to split royalties for Stay With Me with Tom Petty's estate due to a publishing dispute, despite the song's melody being unintentionally similar to Petty's I Won't Back Down. Katy Perry's 2013 hit Dark Horse led to a lawsuit by Christian rapper Flame, who claimed the song copied his 2008 track. Perry lost the case in 2019, exposing how publishers often leave artists vulnerable to litigation. You better ask somebody. Record labels often hoard ownership of artists' work through lengthy, greasy contracts that prioritize corporate profits over creators' rights. Bob Marley's estate. After Marley's death in 1981, Island Records and various publishers controlled much of his catalogue. His family spent decades in legal battles to regain rights and ensure fair compensation. Britney Spears' career exemplifies how these inequitable agreements can strip artists of financial independence and creative freedom. Frank Ocean. To escape his greasy Def Jam contract, Ocean released the visual album Endless in 2016 to fulfill his obligations, then independently released Blonde the next day. This ingenious maneuver exposed the lengths artists must go to regain control of their work. The Weeknd. Early in his career, The Weeknd signed away publishing rights for his trilogy mixtapes to Universal Music Publishing Group, UMPG, limiting his long-term earnings. Megan Thee Stallion. In 2020, Megan sued her label 1501 Certified Entertainment, alleging that her greasy contract was unconscionable and that the label was blocking her from releasing new music unless she renegotiated her deal. Neil Young. In 2021, Young sold a 50% stake in his song catalogue to Hypnosis Songs Fund. While the deal was financially significant, it raised concerns about the increasing power of investment firms over artists' legacies. Really dough. Young or inexperienced musicians are frequently targeted with greasy deals. The Jackson 5 signed greasy contracts as minors that left them with minimal earnings despite their massive success. Aaliyah signed to Jive Records at age 12. In 1991, Aaliyah's early contracts were negotiated without proper legal counsel, leaving her with greasy, unfavorable terms. Her estate later battled Blackground Records for years to release her music on streaming platforms. JoJo. Signed to Blackground Records as a teenager in 2004, JoJo was unable to release new music for nearly a decade due to greasy, restrictive contracts and label disputes. Her original albums were withheld from streaming services until 2018, when she re-recorded them. Aaron Carter. The child star signed with Jive Records at age 9 in 1997. By his teens, he was embroiled in financial disputes with his management, leading to bankruptcy in 2013. His estate continues to battle for control of his masters posthumously. His story mirrors systemic issues with minor artists in the industry. Parent companies like BlackRock and the Carlyle Group benefit from these exploitative practices by owning stakes in major labels. This concentration of power limits artists' ability to negotiate fair terms. Major labels like Universal Music Group, UMG, have faced criticism for prioritizing shareholder profits over fair treatment for artists. Executives such as the notorious Sir Lucian Grange have been accused of perpetuating greasy, inequitable systems within the industry. On mamas. Universal Music Group's 2021 acquisition of Bob Dylan's catalogue for $300 million and the 2022 purchase of Sting's rights exemplify major labels' monopolization of legacy artists' work. In 2016, Sony ATV acquired Michael Jackson's stake in the Beatles' catalogue, consolidating power over iconic works. In 2021, Sony acquired Bruce Springsteen's catalogue for $550 million, sparking debates about major labels hoarding legacy artists' work. Artists like Taylor Swift have criticized such moves as prioritizing profits over creators' legacies. In 2021, Paul Simon sold his entire song catalogue to Sony Music Publishing. While the deal was lucrative, it raised concerns about the increasing concentration of music rights in the hands of a few corporations. The recorded music industry's unscrupulous underbelly practices remain entrenched, evolving from early 20th century exploitation and subjugation of black artists to modern streaming fraud and AI manipulation. All of the named artists reveal systemic inequities in ownership, royalties, and creative control. They are just a very small fraction of the number of artists who fell prey to an abominable music industry. Extremely few artists have had the capacity to challenge these sinister systems, such as James Brown reclaiming his masters. The industry's reliance on greasy contracts and corporate consolidation continues to disadvantage creators. Meaningful reform, including transparent royalty systems and equitable ownership rights, is essential to protect artists in an era of technological disruption. Real spill.